Hello, welcome to this video, and on this video I will be talking about 10 more bands that I never mentioned on this channel. You know, I did a video recently where I talk about 10 bands I never mentioned on this channel. These are all the bands at the comments where people say, why didn't you mention Magma? Why don't you mention, you know, Van de Graaff Generator? Why don't you mention Camel? You know, and as soon as I did that video, everyone had a whole bunch of suggestions about other bands I never talk about. Now, you know, they're not asking me to talk about Boney M. They're not asking me to talk about, you know, I don't know, Lighthouse Family or Crosby, Stills and Nash. They're talking about, you know, bands that are either prog or fusion that they think I should be talking about, and I don't mention them. Now, the conclusion I came to on the last video was the fact that music, there's a part of music which is important to you at a certain time, you know, and you need a certain type of music, and then that music stays for you forever. But you need it at a certain time. So certain bands that you may love, if you'd not come across that band at a certain time in your life when you needed them, right? It's a bit like in, you know, that thing in Harry Potter when Dumbledore says something like, you know, that Hogwarts will always provide, you know, those who need that thing at that certain time, and then the whole room of requirement provides what you want at that time. I think this is what bands do. That was messy. I think that's what bands do. You know, I think, you know, you need something. You need that metal thing, and then you get into metal. And you need something that takes you out in a bigger world, so you get into prog. And then you want to hear the groove, and you get into funk. And this is what happens. And those are the bands that stay with you. So a lot of the time when people say, "What about these bands?" You go, "No, they never met me at that time." And you've come across them when you're a later date, and you think they're great, but they never have got that grip into you, so you don't mention them. You know, we cannot, you know, listen to absolutely everything. This is the whole thing. I think, you know, this channel, you know, what is my channel about? It's about me, right, who is a musician. I've spent 40 years playing the drums, you know, producing music, playing in bands, and I've played in some prog bands, you know, and I've played for Robert Plant, you know, and I think I'm trying to bring that perspective in. So I don't prepare. I don't do any research for these videos. You know, I make the list and then I start talking. And some of these bands I know very little about. You know, I have my take on that band, right? So shall we get in to 10 more bands that I never mentioned in my channel and I don't know that much about, you know? So this is what you're going to get. And so why don't I like them? What is it about them? And I will tell you whether they're not on my channel because I do like them, but they just were never on my radar, and I've come to appreciate them later, and that's all it is, but I do like them. Or it's a band that I don't like. And at 10, we have a band that I don't like very much, and that is Marillion. Now, at some point, I'm going to do a video on neo-prog, but neo-prog's very close to me because I was the drummer with IQ. I've also played with the guys from Pendragon. I've played with the guys from Palace. Right, so that's three of the. Is there 5 neo-prog sort of bands? You know, you got Marillion, 12th Night, IQ, Palace, and Pendragon. Was there anything else? All the, you know, Solstice. You know, so neo-prog now. Neo-prog emerges in the early 80s and was championed through all the channels that I was receiving music from, those primarily being Tommy Vance's Friday Rock Show and Kerrang. I can remember Marillion being covered in Kerrang when they were still called Silmarillion. I was aware that there was a progressive rock band that was coming out, so when they came out with their first records, I checked them out and I didn't like them. I think partly was the fact that it seemed very derivative of Genesis, but it had an 80s sound to it which I didn't particularly like, and they didn't seem to be particularly virtuoso, whereas IQ seemed to be more virtuoso, and IQ had a darker sound to them which I liked more. Palace seemed to have a more of a sort of heavier sound, more of a rock sound to them, and I like that more. Marillion were the least favourite of the neo-prog bands, but I was never a huge fan of any of the neo-prog bands. I think IQ came into their own as time went on. You know, I think the early albums early IQ albums are absolute masterpieces, but of course they were made in sort of guerrilla circumstances. You know, this is a band living all together in one room, basically with the multi-track in their living room, and they're mixing off cassette tapes to take out to sell at gigs. They didn't land the major deal till later. Marillion did. They landed the major deal, and we get Script for a Jester's Tear, which I remember hearing when it came out, and then Misplaced Childhood. And this was one of the biggest albums of the 80s. All my friends had it. To me, it was in the same bracket as sort of Dire Straits. It was pedestrian. There was moments that I could appreciate, but I was listening by this time. I was listening to the Mavish Doctor and Return to Forever. It just did not impinge on me. Now, I know that me playing in IQ and the fan base that has come to this channel, I know there'll be some hardcore neo-prog fans, and there's going to be some, Marillion fans watching this. And someone said to me the other day, said, well, what have you checked out the new, it was one of my patrons, have you checked out the new Marillion album? And I had to listen to it. It's to me, it's not even prog anymore. I don't know what it is. It's like post Roger Waters Pink Floyd. That's what it sounds like to me. I would categorise it in the bracket of dad rock. That's where they're at the moment. So I don't get Marillion. When I did my sort of 10 greatest prog bands at the time, yeah, I put them on the list. I appreciate what they've done for this form, and I know that it was incredible to have a full out prog band in the 80s. In the charts. In some ways they went even further out than some of the 70s prog bands. But I never got it. I've listened to them loads, and I just don't get it. That's it. So that's what I've got at number 10. At number 9, we've got another 80s bands who were champions for prog, but for me were champions for prog in a far more interesting way, and that was the incredible It Bites. Now I first came across It Bites when Francis was on the Twang Bang Kerrang Channel 4 documentary on guitar, and I can remember watching what looked like a sort of well scrubbed 80s pop star, because that's the way they were marketed. This band that I knew because they'd been in the charts with Calling All the Heroes, which was great, and I liked that. In fact, I was in a band where we ripped off the bass line of Calling All the Heroes. So I liked that, but then seeing him on there and seeing this sort of bleached blonde, good looking pop star sitting there with his Squire Strat just burning incredible Holsworth like legato, right? That I remember noticing that. Did I run out and get the It Bites album? I didn't. So they were on my radar. I thought they were great, but by the late 80s, what was I listening to by then? I was going towards. I was listening to a lot of pre-grungy, 89, 90. I was listening to a lot of like Soundgarden. I was listening to a lot of jungle, hip hop, Public Enemy. I'd moved on. That whole prog thing. My route through music was metal, then prog, then jazz fusion, then jazz, then being a jazz snob and only listen to acoustic ECM jazz, then suddenly rediscovering the Red Hot Chili Peppers, Bill Laswell, going down sort of experimental electronica route at the time when all this stuff, suddenly there was a renaissance of music, I feel, in the early 90s. So I think It Bites is sort of 86, 87. At that point, I would have been in the heights of my jazz snobbery. When I came out of that, I was listening to Ronnie Size or Goldie or Lamb. So I just wasn't into that thing, and I wasn't listening to any fusion at that point. So they're all the bands I do listen to that I never mentioned on this channel, and I try and sneak them in any at that time. So that's who we've got at number 9 is It Bites. I'm going to carry on talking actually, because years later I joined Frost, and they're all huge It Bite fans, and John Mitchell, the guitarist of Frost, is an absolutely huge It Bites fan, and he forms a band with Keno, who has I've forgotten his bloody name, Beck from the keyboardist, and he got the drummer from It Bites. I do know these guys. This is real brain fog. You get to a certain age, and this has happened more and more on my channel. If I sit there quietly, I will remember it's John Beck, and sorry, drummer, and I know you so well. You know, I've sit and chatted to you, but and anyway, John Mitchell managed to reform It Bites with him taking over from the Francis Dunnery role. They made some incredible albums, 2 or 3 albums. They're really, really great. I remember going to see them live, and they were brilliant. I think I saw them live twice with the John Mitchell It Bites. How much the true It Bites fans judge the John Mitchell It Bites as being the true It Bites, I don't know. Francis Dunnery is out playing, as you know, doing it songs with the guitarist of another band I was in called Kiyama, who's got a guitarist called Luke Machine. So I'm very close. I'm actually quite close to this sort of It Bites world, and also I feel an affinity with Francis Dunnery. I think the guy is a genius. I really do. I think he's possibly the greatest progressive rock guitarist of the last 40 years. That's saying something, but he could well be. I think the guy's an absolute genius. I love his mind. It's so left field. And when I played with Robert Plant, of course, Francis had played guitar with Robert. And so many stories that Robert would tell with great affection were to do with Francis, which is surprising because Francis was out and out prog, and Robert would have hated that, but he loved Francis. And I was into prog and fusion and Al Holdsworth, and I played with Robert Plant, and I would love to sit down with Francis at some point and talk to him about that experience of being a prog fan in the Robert Plant band, because how many people have had that experience? Me and Francis, I don't know who else. Anyway, let's move on. I just thought I'd mention that. So I'm quite close to that band, you know, and sometimes when I feel quite close to a band, I won't mention them that much. Another band I've got links with is Uriah Heep. I got number 8. My mate Russell Gilbrook plays drums for Uriah Heep, and the incredible John Jowett, who is my partner in crime in the world of prog rhythm sections. You know, I've played with John in Frost. I've played him in IQ, and he's in the bass player in my prog band Rain. And John has also played bass on quite a few gigs a few years back with Uriah Heep. Uriah Heep are the source of a game that I have heard been played on tour when you're on a tour bus. And there's a game you can play where you have to name a band, and if nobody can name a track by that band, then you win the game, right? So someone might say Led Zeppelin, then you say, you know, Black Dog, and they say, well, Deep Purple, Machine Head, right? And then you say Uriah Heep, and everyone goes, oh, Uriah Heep song, right? You know, and if you can do that and no one can mention a song, then you win. And that game we used to call Uriah Heep, the Uriah Heep game. Uriah Heep, I would say, are in the 4 founding bands of heavy rock, heavy metal, which would be Led Zeppelin, Deep Purple, Black Sabbath, and Uriah Heep. Very heavy, very humble, very heavy, very humble from 1970 is one of the first sort of heavy metal records. They're in there at the same time of Black Sabbath. And I think from that point of they take a trajectory like Black Sabbath of moving towards prog, but they move towards prog even more than Black Sabbath. After that, I can't tell you much about them. I have listened recently, when I did my dumb history of heavy metal, I talked about Black Sabbath, I listened to the first album. That was the first time I've ever sat down and listened to a Uriah Heep album. I can't tell you much more than that. They never figured on my radar coming up. I think they're actually a very, very important band, and I think the point is they didn't, even though they sold millions of albums, they didn't seem to occupy that cultural space. Some bands do and some bands don't, you know. Ozzy Osbourne's actually is absolutely iconic as a frontman, and I don't know whether Uriah Heep didn't have a Robert Plant or Ozzy Osbourne. that was iconic, which and I'm sure they've made some incredible music and they're great, and I'm sure their live album's brilliant. I have never listened to them. The only album I've ever heard is that first album, and I listened to that about 2 weeks ago. So that's who I've got at number 8, never fixed on my radar. When I did listen to yeah, it sounded okay. It sounded like pretty good 70s rock to me. Nothing wrong with that. At number 7, I have the Tubes. Right, I have one Tubes album in there somewhere. So at some point, and if there's a vinyl album in there, that's in my classic album buying period. That's all these albums in here, they're my formation albums. That's who I am. If you go through that door there's 1,000 CDs, and they're albums I bought later. All right. There's a Tube album in there. I couldn't even tell you what it's called. I can remember I bought it, I listened to it, it was okay. I never wanted to listen to them again. That's the truth of the Tubes. I think it was their second album. I should really dig it out. It's the one, you'll tell me which one it is. It's the one where they got the airbrush t-shirts on and like a tube of squirted out stuff, and I think they got airbrush t-shirts on with their faces on. Which album's that? And I'm sure you're going to go, no, that's the album you shouldn't have, Andy. No one, you didn't like that album. You need to get so-and-so. Well, tell me which Tubes album I should listen to, because I want to like the Tubes. I wanted to like the Tubes 35 years ago when I bought that album. I wanted to like to them. I'd read up about them. They seem like some sort of rocky new wave Frank Zappa type band. That's what they seemed like to me. I wanted to be blown away by them, and I wasn't. Often when I was younger, if a band could be great, but if they didn't have that level of virtuosity, I didn't pursue it. This is definitely what happened with Marillion, and it could be the fact with the Tubes, they just didn't have the same sort of level of virtuosity that I wanted, or I got from Return to Forever or the Mavish Yorkshire. But anyway, that's what I've got at number 7 is the Tubes. Right, now let's go to the other end of virtuosity with this next band that I never mentioned at number 6. Right, I would say if we're just talking about sheer virtuosity, you cannot beat Frank Zappa. Zappa's level of virtuosity is an incredible level, and I've always felt there's only one other band that could compete with Zappa in terms of instrumental virtuosity, and that is Henry Cow. Henry Cow, I've always called Gentle Giant Prog's Prog, right? But actually, the truth is Prog's Prog. In other words, the dense, difficult music that exists in the same way as prog exists to the mainstream. That's what I mean. It's possibly Henry Cow. I have listened to them many times. It might just be a little bit too much for me. I've listened to them many a time. My God, they're incredible players, incredibly virtuoso, in incredible compositions that seem to skirt between like modern classical, avant-garde, Dada, extreme free jazz. They seem to be right on the limits of what we can class as rock music, and I think that is the fundamental goal of what progressive rock is to redefine what we class as rock music, and God, Henry Cow has done that more than anyone else. I've listened to him, and it's really impressive, but dense, very, very dense. Of course, some of those guys have gone on to do all sorts of other music. Fred Frith has appeared with Naked City, who I absolutely love, and there seems to be a link between, these extreme prog bands of the 70s and some of the avant-garde jazz stuff that was happening with Zorn and Laswell, Last Exit in the 80s. This video, I cannot say much more about them. I don't know that much more. A lot of these, with the other video, I had more to say about them. But with Henry Cow, incredible band. Can I say I like them? I don't know. Difficult. It's the same sort of response, and this is my honest response that I have when I start talking about Trackmaster Replica by Captain Beefheart. I love Beefheart, but Trackmaster Replica does not seem it seems not as focused. That's probably why people don't like it. You probably got to appreciate the lack of focus. Or the extreme focus. It's just so focused. That might well be the answer to Trapmaster Replica, Henry Cow. Anyway, I just don't know what to say about them. You wanted the list of the why don't I talk about my channel? Because I never listened to them, and I've listened to them, and I've delved into them, and it didn't strike me. Number 5 is a band that I really do like. I just don't really like them, and that's Steely Dan. Steely Dan are the sort of, along with Stevie Wonder, is the pop vocal end of jazz fusion. There's been brilliant. I mean, I've got Asia, and I've talked about that album on my channel. With Wayne Shorter and that incredible drum solo by Steve Gadd. I've got back there the double album on vinyl of the greatest hits of Steely Dan, which I absolutely love. Body's That Fur, and all those. Ricky, Don't Lose That Number. I love all those songs. I could put a Steely Dan album on and I really will enjoy it. It's great, right? I really like them. There's something about them however, that never propelled me to go out and buy every single album. I'm no expert on them, especially the earlier stuff. I think they start as a sort of boogie, funky songwriter band, and then at some point they change, don't they, into this sort of dense jazz fusion, heavy chord thing, which just they get more and more and more. I've got the Don Fagen album Nightfly, which I absolutely love. It's a beautifully produced album. I really like that, and I really like, is it Kamikariad or something? That's that it's got Snow Blind on it. That Don Fagen, I absolutely love that. And I've got quite a few concert DVDs and bootleg DVDs when they came back around about 2006, 2007 with Keith Carlock on drums, and they got Ricky Lawson on drums. I love all that. I have actually got quite a lot now, I say it. I do really like them live. I think when they came back, I preferred them live. And you know what I think I don't like them? I'm not a massive fan of that sort of anal retentive perfection thing in any art form. That's something I don't like. I react against it. Now, in Steely Dan's case, this discussion of them having like 100 takes, they're not after perfection. They're just waiting for someone to drop the magic. I understand that, and I know that's what they're about. But there is that perfection aesthetic in Steely Dan, and I'm not a fan of that at all. I think that perfection is the enemy of music, and there's a sort of Steely Dan, they do this well because it's tempered by a sort of beatnik jazz thing that's underlying in their music as well, which gives it an edge. Without that, it could easily become Fusak, right? But they do really, and I'm not saying they're Fusak, but they really do traverse the edges of Fusak. And I think the commercial success they had such an impact on all that crud that came out of GRP in the 80s. And I think it's that is like 80% I love. That 20% I don't quite trust of Steely Dan. They need some edge. They need someone to go up and ruffle their hair. Right? They need to plug the guitar in. They need to get a bit of feedback. They need to get them guys. They need Miles Davis in there, pushing them into a realm where they don't know what the hell they're doing. They knew what they were doing too well. Steely Dan. At number 4, I have XTC. I've talked about the punk rock and how it's not the anathema to prog and how it revitalized prog, and there is no band that is an example of that more than XTC. Some of the greatest pop songs, pop songwriting, some of the most interesting fusion between the English aesthetic, progressive rock tendencies and the new wave and punk. I think they're absolutely incredible band. I don't know enough about them. I do really love them. And one of my favourite albums of all time is The English Settlement. And it's the only album I have. And I think The English Settlement is perhaps their greatest album. I think I bought that. I've got it on vinyl back there and I absolutely loved it. I listened to it a lot. When I dipped into the other albums, for me, coming from the progressive rock album, that is the album that you need to buy. And I don't think I ever need to buy anything else. I absolutely love that album. And I think if I was to make a top 10 albums that embody the English aesthetic, which is something I talk about on this channel, and I think it's integral to prog, and it's integral to punk as well. It's the thing that binds those two things together, is this English aesthetic. I think XTC are just one of the greatest exponents of that of all time. Absolutely incredible band. I do love them. So they're on the love list. I love them. No expert on them, but I do love them. That's who I've got at number 4. And number 3, I have Colosseum. Not Colosseum 2, because I've mentioned them a couple of times on the channel. Colosseum 2, I love. Right? Strange New Flesh, War's Dance, Electric Savage. They are brilliant. That band with Gary Moore, you know, John Hosman on drums, obviously, because it's his band, but then Gary Moore and John Mole and Neil Murray on bass, you know, and Don Airy on keyboards. For me, they were like the British Al Di Meola, right? Jazz fusion with just a little bit of whining and heavy guitar. Gary Moore's brilliant. So, yeah, Colosseum 2 I love, and I've mentioned them. Colosseum, the original band, this has gone down in history of being one of the great progressive rock bands, of early bands, you know, one of the founding progressive rock bands, along with King Crimson and the Nice. And Colosseum are there right from the beginning. I think the reason why we don't champion them as being an early progressive rock band is because they're not a progressive rock band, really. They're a jazz fusion band. They're actually an early jazz fusion band. I've just done a video, which should be out by now, where I've talked at length about Colosseum, because I've talked about 10 moments when mainstream artists went prog and fusion, and I've talked about Variations by Andrew Lloyd Webber, which of course is a Colosseum album in effect, because that's the band on there, Colosseum 2. But I've talked about the original Colosseum, and I've made this point that they're very, very important in terms of the history of jazz fusion. They're one of the first jazz fusion bands, and they played a very important part in that. They're the bridge between the pioneering jazz fusion rhythm and blues bands like the Graham Bond, Georgie Fames, all those that really were like fusing jazz and rhythm and blues, which becomes rock music but also becomes jazz fusion. And then Colosseum grow out of that in the late 60s. Very, very important band, without a doubt. But I think they're a fusion band. The Valentine's Suite I listen to, and I think what it is it's like a lot of those bands, they're very important, but as a kid growing up, you're going to rather go and listen to Brand X if it comes to British jazz fusion than the first Colosseum. And I heard Valentine's Suite, and it was, yeah, this is okay, I like this, you know, the production's not that great, and you know, it's a bit 60s, and that's how I felt about it. But yeah, very, very important band, and I could listen to them, and I like them, and I rate them, and that's who I've got at number 3. Right, and number 2. This is a momentous prog band that I just never mention, and I'm a fan of them as well. And that's Focus. And Focus are not just a progressive rock band, they're also a jazz fusion band. At one point in the 70s, they made some weird album, which is almost like sort of disco jazz fusac. Right, they've done so much, and they've been around for so long. So what am I going to say about Focus, right? I really do like him. Jan Ackerman, incredible guitarist. And how many times have people said, why didn't you mention Jan Ackerman? You not like him? He's incredible. And if you listen to Jan Ackerman in the early 70s, he's playing the guitar with a technique which is unrivaled. There's only John McLaughlin and a few that are playing at the same level as him. He really is far out in terms of his technique. This Van Leer has got an incredible vision. Anyone who likes that proggy flute sound that Jethro Tull have pioneered, then you've also got to check out Focus. And they make a run of absolutely classic prog albums that I just do not mention enough. You know, Focus 3, Moving Waves, those albums are just absolute classics, absolutely brilliant. There's so much on there. This is the actual truth about me and Focus. When I was growing up, I heard Hocus Pocus. Now, Hocus Pocus is a seminal prog track because it's crossed over into the mainstream. God knows why this one has. So this sort of yodeling heavy metal workout which is basically all it is, has sort of crossed over into mainstream culture and was a huge hit record. Everyone knows that track. It's out and out prog and fusion, but I think it's managed to carve out its own novelty space. And I heard that and I thought it was great. And when I was a kid, there used to be a TV show that we used to have to watch on TV as part of the sort of, when I was a kid in the 70s, you would have to watch the sort of educational programs in your school. So there was no internet and there was no video cassette recordings then. So in the daytime at a certain time, so around about 10:30, the BBC would put the children's schools programs on. And this is very exciting to us because the teacher would wheel in, you know, the big TV, and then we'd have to sit there and wait, and they'd put the telly on, and then something would start up and they'd tell us about sex education or something like that, or Picture Box would come out and freak us out or whatever. And I wish I knew which one it is, but one of the TV shows that we had a focus tune as the theme. I think it was Sylvia, and Sylvia's a killer tune, absolutely brilliant. So those two songs I became aware of very young, you know, very early on. And I went down the record shop and I found an album called, I think it was called Moving Waves, the best of Focus. It wasn't the album Moving Waves. It was a compilation of the best of those classic albums, you know. And I bought that album. This is so often the case that I love that album. I listened to it. I didn't need any more. I didn't feel the urge to go and get any more of this band. And that was my Focus album. That was it, was the best of Focus. At some point when I was buying fusion albums, I would go into the record shop and I would swap my old, especially New Wave and British Heavy Metal albums. I swapped a ton of those. I think all my Judas Priest albums, except I think even Sin After Sin I actually got rid of eventually. You know, I think I had virtually all the Judas Priest albums up to Point of Entry, and I swapped every single one, you know, for you know, jazz fusion albums. And I remember going in and swapping a Focus album, I think for an Alan Holdsworth album, I'm just thinking about the me bargaining. Oh, I've got this Focus album, I like that, but they've got an Alan Holdsworth album, and I'm not going to be able to get that Alan Holdsworth album because it's that hen's teeth, you know. If you've found a copy of Metal Fatigue or Road Games, I think I swapped it for Road Games. You know how hard it was to get Road Games. So I swapped my Focus album for it, and I can't even remember what was on it. So as much as I love Focus, it just did not impinge. So why didn't it impinge on me? And I think there is something extremely moving about the English progressive rock bands that once I'd grown out of being impressed by the virtuosity, there's something inherent in the music of Yes and the music of Genesis, in the music of even Pink Floyd, which has something profound in there that still chimes with me, even though I've grown out of being impressed by the virtuosity of that. And it's this thing called the English aesthetic. And I've mentioned it on here. I'm going to have to do a video on the English aesthetic. I think I need a whole video to really explain what I mean by this. All different types of art forms have it. And when I experience it, it affects me deeply. And I just think Focus didn't have it. Because of them being a European prog band, and they weren't all dark like Can or Faust or Magma. They weren't like that. They had a lot of the twee elements that make the British progressive rock band so great, but they just didn't deliver it. It just was twee. I think that's how I would describe Focus. Is they're just too twee. And they don't possess the English aesthetic. So, do you want to know what the English aesthetic is? So I'm going to give you a very esoteric description of what the English aesthetic is. If you want to know what it is, there is a film by Powell and Pressburger, which were two filmmakers. One was British and one was Hungarian. And there's a video on my channel, because there are esoteric things on my channel. And one of the esoteric things on my channel is this video about Michael Powell and Emmerich Pressburger, where I talk about their films. And there is a film by them called The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp. And there is a sequence when Anton Walbrook, I think it is, who is playing a German, is trying to enter the UK during the war. And this film was made during the war. And he gains entry by describing his love as a German for the English aesthetic. And in that speech, which is one of the great speeches in acting history, Anton Walbrook just nails it. And if you listen to that speech, the way it's shot and the way it's filmed and what it's about, that scene, he explains what the English aesthetic is. It's not something that only English people can appreciate. That's the whole point. It's loved the whole world over. And I think it's what makes so many cultural exports of England and Britain, but specifically England, because I'm not to denigrate the Scottish aesthetic or the Irish aesthetic of the world. They are really strong aesthetics as well, and the Scottish aesthetic is its own thing, and I love that too. But the English aesthetic is the thing that you get in progressive rock, and if you watch that scene, he explains it. That's as much as I'm going to say. Those of you who really want to get deep into this can do that. And if you want to know more, I will go deeper into it. It's part of the heart that forms this channel. It's part of the heart. What have I got at number one? At number one, I've got Dream Theater. Dream Theater I first came across when the Images and Words album came out, which I bought at the time. I bought it because my students had discovered this incredible band, and they were coming into college and saying to me, check out this band, they're amazing, they're incredible players, they're doing this, this and this. What you had then was a bunch of young metalers that had been listening to Metallica and they'd been listening to Anthrax and suddenly discovered Dream Theater, and it busts their world open. There's a certain time when you need to hear something. Me, in my 20s, I'd gone through metal, I'd gone through prog, I'd gone through fusion, I'd gone to avant-garde jazz. I'd come out of that and I was listening to experimental music, electronica, rap, hip-hop, and then somebody puts a Dream Theater album on and I'm like, yeah, I've heard all this. Sounds like Rush and Iron Maiden mixed together. That's what I remember saying when I first heard them. And I was a little bit put off by the sort of whole hair metal thing about Dream Theater. Now, they are much better than that. They really are. But that's what I heard on Images and Words. And it is a great album, but for me, wrong place, the wrong time. So I didn't have any interest in Dream Theater whatsoever. Years later, when I joined the world of progressive rock and I joined IQ and Frost, this band came up over and over again, and people would say, what do you think of Dream Theater? I go, no, just don't listen to them. No, whatever. I just heard them, you know. Sometimes I can remember I'd be sat in Holland packing my drums away after a gig with IQ, and they'd be playing something in the venue afterwards, and what's this? Sounds like a cross between Rush and Iron Maiden. Oh, it's Dream Theater. Oh, yeah. My mates would buy me tickets, and I'd go and see Dream Theater, and I'd sit through it, and I can remember when I saw Dream Theater live, there was at one point where you had like a Dream Theater fan who were all predominantly male. They're sort of male, pale male nerds. And the audience was full of them, 9,000 of these people. And there was one bit where there was a Dream Theater fan, and they had it on the video, and this wolf came out, and the wolf was scaring the nerd. You scaring him. But then Dream Theater emerged, and through their very fast neoclassical licks, they frightened the wolf away. And I remember thinking, what does the wolf represent? It's something that's not here at all at this gig. I'll tell you what I realised it was. Sex! That's what it was! It was that was scaring the nerd. So that was the attitude I had towards Dream Theater. Then suddenly, Mike Portnoy's doing an interview for Modern Drummer, and someone said to him, what drummers do you listen to at the moment? And he went, I really like Andy Edwards. I like his drumming on Pocket Sun. And at one point, I was like, oh my God, I'm being mentioned in Modern Drummer by Mike Portnoy. And then the next thing, they ask us to go for Frost to go and open them up on their world tour. We turned it down. We couldn't do it. It would have been an incredible experience to go around the world with Dream Theater for a year. But we did open up on the UK tour. And if I meet a Frost fan now in the UK, predominantly they know that band because they saw us on that tour, because we were playing to like 5,000 people a night. So it was like thousands of people saw Frost on that tour. I can remember turning up to that gig, meeting Jordan Rudess, who was the most incredible musician and the nicest guy in the world. And he said, I remember he came up to me and he went, you're a drummer, aren't you? And I said, yeah, that's right. And he said, do you know I used to play for Tony Williams? I was like, what? In what band? He said, oh, he had a band with Jan Hammer. What? You were the keyboardist for Jan Hammer with Tony Williams on drums? I was like, oh my God. The guys, they're genius musicians. And I can remember we sound checked, got through our thing, and then Dream Theater came out and sound checked. And I can remember seeing them play live. My jaw just hit the floor. They really are the greatest prog metal band in history. Absolute virtuosos, incredible musicians, incredible music. It was just like a machine, an absolute machine. And so at that point I was like, oh my God, sometimes you've got to see something live like that. I'd seen them live, but that was at the back of an audience. But, actually stood on the stage. I was actually on the stage watching them play. Like, we've just played. Right, you think you're good. Now sling your hook, I can remember the last gig we did, which was down in Southampton or somewhere. Steve Wilson came to watch it, and I can remember, sat there playing, and Steve Wilson's watching in the audience with Mike Portnoy and the guys from Dream Theater. So I have the utmost respect for them. I also have a great mistrust for anything like that, and I've said my two penneth about prog metal. There's stuff I do like by them, and when they get all heavy and proggy, I can't help. I'm a sucker for that stuff. I really am. And when they do all that stuff, I'd love to name a track where they do that, but I can't. So we have come to the end of the video. 45 minutes about me talking about bands I know nothing about. I hope you enjoyed it, but it was worth stopping, I think, for the Dream Theater reference, wasn't it? I'm pleased I hit the nail on the head there, didn't I? I did, yes. So we're done. So if you like this video, then like it. If you want to hear more, then subscribe and press the notification bell. If you want to support me, there's a Patreon down below and a link to that, and you can support me doing that. And I'm done now. I'll see you on the next video. Thanks for watching. Bye.